The noon sun over Dry Willow, Arizona territory, was a merciless hammer. It beat down on the wide, dusty street, bleaching the life from the clapboard storefronts and raising a shimmering heat that made the distant mesas tremble. A hot wind, tasting of grit and sage, gusted through the town. Too tired to bring relief, but just strong enough to stir the fine red dust that settled on everything. It coated the watering troughs, the hitching posts, and the windows of Hart's Mercantile, where inside, the air was thick with the competing scents of ground coffee, cured leather, and the faint, metallic smell of lead. Eliza Hart stood behind the long oak counter, her brow furrowed in concentration. A single beam of dusty sunlight cut through the gloom of the store, illuminating the fly specks on a jar of peppermint sticks and the delicate lines around her eyes. Lines etched not by age, but by the constant, unblinking glare of the desert. She was 28, a woman shaped by this harsh land, with a spine as straight as the barrels of the shotguns racked behind her and an intelligence in her steady gray eyes that missed very little. She was carefully counting out lead cartridges, her fingers, though slender, moving with a practiced efficiency. She lined them up in neat rows of 10 on the smooth wood of the counter. 50 for the Rocking R Ranch, 100 for the Miller brothers. It was a man's work, most would say. But her father's eyes had grown too dim for the small, precise task, and Eliza had long since stopped caring what most people would say. Her world was the store, its inventory, its ledgers, and the quiet, ordered life she had built within its walls. A life of duty to her father, a life of independence. The two were tangled together like threads in a tight knot. A small brass scale sat at the end of the counter, its pans perfectly balanced. To Eliza, it was more than a tool for weighing out flour and beans. It was an emblem of the precarious balance of life in Dry Willow, of the fairness she tried to maintain in their dealings, a fairness that felt increasingly fragile in a town buzzing with talk of the coming railroad. The railroad was a promise of prosperity for some, a threat of upheaval for others. For Eliza, it was a low rumble on a distant horizon, another complication in a life she fought to keep simple. The little bell above the door chimed, a sharp, incongruous sound in the sleepy afternoon heat. Eliza did not look up immediately, her focus still on the last row of cartridges. "Be with you in a moment," she said, her voice calm and even. A pair of worn leather boots stopped on the other side of the counter. They were caked with the same red dust that covered the street, but it was a deeper, richer red, the dust of long travel. Silence stretched, thick and heavy. She finished her count, pushing the last cartridge into place with her forefinger, and finally lifted her gaze. The man standing before her was a silhouette against the blinding glare of the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered. He wore a low-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but she did not need to see his features. She knew the line of that jaw, the set of those shoulders. She would have known him in the deepest dark, in the howling of a winter storm. 18 years had passed, 18 years of dust and sun and silence, but they fell away in the space of a single, hitched breath. Her heart gave a painful lurch, a sudden, violent kick against her ribs like a startled horse. The composure she wore like armor threatened to crack. He took off his hat, and the shadows fell away. His face was leaner, harder than she remembered, carved by wind and time. New lines fanned from the corners of his eyes, and a scar, a thin white slash, cut through one eyebrow. But the eyes were the same, as dark and deep as a desert well, and they were fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. Jonah Cole. The name was a ghost on her tongue. He held the hat in his hands. Turning the brim, he looked around the store, at the shelves stacked high with bolts of calico and tins of coffee, at the sacks of flour and sugar, at the brass scale glinting in the sliver of light. It was as if he was taking inventory of the years he had missed. Finally, his eyes came back to hers. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rasp. rough with dust and something else she could not name. "I have come back for something I dropped," he said, the words slow and deliberate. "A promise." The air left Eliza's lungs in a quiet rush. She placed her hands flat on the counter to steady herself, to ground herself in the solid reality of the oak beneath her palms. The cartridges lay between them, small, leaden weights. She met his gaze, forcing her own to be as unyielding as the desert rock. "You are 18 years late. Jonah." A flicker of something, pain perhaps, or regret, crossed his face. He gave a slow nod. "I know," he said. "I have practiced my apology for just as many miles. It seems I have worn it out along the way." The bell chimed again, and the spell was broken. Sheriff Barrett Pike stepped into the store, bringing a chill with him that had nothing to do with the heat outside. He was a handsome man, in a sharp, predatory way, with a neatly trimmed mustache and eyes the color of faded denim that saw everything and gave nothing away. He had been sheriff for 5 years, and he wore his authority like a well-tailored coat. His gaze moved from Eliza to Jonah, and a tightness settled around his mouth. "Eliza," he said, his voice a smooth baritone. He touched the brim of his hat, but his eyes stayed on Jonah, cataloging the worn gun belt, the travel-stained clothes. "The stranger's presence just came for a box of shells for my Spencer." "Of course, Sheriff," Eliza said, her voice a little too tight. She turned to get the ammunition, grateful for the excuse to look away from Jonah's searching eyes. She could feel the tension in the room, a palpable thing, like the air before a lightning strike. 2 men, as different as day and night, standing in her store, in her life. Pike leaned an elbow on the counter, his posture casual, but his eyes were not. Passing through, he asked Jonah. The question was mild, but it carried the weight of a formal inquiry. "Just arrived," Jonah answered, his tone just as level. He did not seem intimidated by the badge. "We have had some trouble lately," Pike continued, his gaze flicking to Eliza for a moment. "Sable Jack and his crew have been seen up near the pass. We are not looking for any more trouble in Dry Willow." The message was clear. Do not be trouble. Jonah met his stare without flinching. "I am just here to settle a debt." Eliza returned with the box of shells and placed it on the counter, next to the scale. Pike put a coin down, his eyes still locked with Jonah's. It was a silent battle of wills, fought over her counter, and Eliza felt a surge of anger. She was not a prize to be contested. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut the tension. She slid the coin into the cash drawer. Pike finally looked at her, a smile touching his lips but not his eyes. He saw himself as her protector, her suitor, a notion she had politely but firmly discouraged on multiple occasions. "Just making sure you are safe. Eliza, a woman alone has to be careful." His words were for her, but the warning was for Jonah. He gave Jonah one last, hard look before turning and leaving the store, the bell announcing his departure with another sharp chime. The silence he left behind was heavier than before. "He seems concerned for your welfare," Jonah said, a dry note in his voice. "Sheriff Pike is concerned with everything that happens in this town," Eliza replied coolly. She began to slide the cartridges she had counted into a small canvas bag. "And are you a woman alone, Eliza?" he asked, his voice softer now. The question hung in the air. In the eyes of the town, she was a spinster at 28, tied to her father's store. But she was not alone. She had her father. She had her small class of children she taught to read in the afternoons. She had herself. "I am not helpless, if that is what you are asking." From the back of the store, a voice called out, warm and laced with humor despite its age. "Is that coffee I smell burning? Or is it just the tension out here?" Silas Hart emerged from the storeroom, a tall, stooped man with a shock of white hair and eyes that, though clouded with cataracts, still held a shrewd twinkle. He navigated the cluttered aisles with a familiar ease, his hand brushing against a sack of pinto beans, then a stack of tin plates. "Eliza, you did not tell me we had a customer." He stopped and tilted his head, peering at Jonah. "You are a big one. Can't quite make out your face. Step a little closer. Son." Jonah took a step forward, into the beam of light. Silas squinted, his brow furrowed. A slow smile spread across his face, a map of wrinkles deepening around his eyes. "Well, I will be," he breathed. "Jonah Cole, the boy who promised my daughter he would come back and build her a house with a porch swing big enough for two." Jonah's face softened. "Mr. Hart, it is good to see you, sir." "It is Silas. Son, it has always been Silas," the old man said, extending a hand. Jonah took it, and Silas's grip was surprisingly firm. 18 years is a long time to be gone. The world changes. People change. He glanced at his daughter, whose face was an unreadable mask. "The hotel in town will charge you an arm and a leg for a bed full of bugs. The room upstairs is empty. You are welcome to it. No charge for old friends." "Father," Eliza protested, her voice low. "We cannot." "Nonsense," Silas cut in, waving a dismissive hand. "The boy looks like he has been sleeping on rocks for a month. We will not turn him out. It is not the Hart way." He turned his clouded eyes back to Jonah. "You will stay." It was not a question. Jonah looked at Eliza, a question in his eyes, seeking her permission. For a moment, she saw the boy he had been. The earnest 12-year-old who had carved their initials into the trunk of the old cottonwood tree down by the creek. J+E, enclosed in a lopsided heart. She had gone back there, years later. The bark had swollen around the carving, the letters growing faint and distorted. Time slowly swallowing the promise, just as she had tried to. But time had not swallowed the man. He was here, and her father, in his simple, stubborn kindness, had just invited the past to come and sleep under their roof. Her mind screamed no, a torrent of sensible objections. It was improper. The town would talk. Sheriff Pike would be insufferable. It would dredge up feelings she had worked so hard to bury. But her heart, that traitorous organ, beat a different rhythm. A slow, deep thrum of anticipation that both terrified and thrilled her. She looked at Jonah, at the dust on his shoulders and the weariness in his eyes, and saw the long road he had traveled to stand here. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "He can stay." "Father?" Jonah's shoulders relaxed, a subtle easing of the tension he had carried into the store. "Thank you, Silas, Eliza. I am grateful." Later that evening, after the store was closed and the supper dishes were washed, Eliza stood by her window, looking out at the darkened street. A single lamp burned in the window of the sheriff's office. She could feel Jonah's presence in the room above, a weight, a warmth, a disturbance in the quiet order of her life. He had brought the outside world with him, a world of dust and distance and broken promises now being called due. Down by the creek, the old cottonwood stood in the moonlight, its leaves whispering in the night breeze. She wondered if the letters were still there, hidden in the rough bark. J+E, a promise made by children, a debt to be settled by adults, and in the fragile balance of dry willow, she feared a heart was about to be weighed and found wanting. The morning after Jonah's return broke with a familiar, brassy glare. A new rhythm established itself in Hart's Mercantile, a quiet accommodation of a third person in their small universe. Jonah rose before the sun, and by the time Eliza came downstairs, the scent of fresh coffee already filled the kitchen. He did not speak much, but moved with a purpose that filled the space around him. He was a man accustomed to work, and he found it easily. "Father, you cannot lift that," Eliza said, rushing toward the front of the store where Silas was struggling with a 100-pound sack of flour. Before she could reach him, Jonah was there. He moved past her with a quiet, "Allow me," and hoisted the sack onto his shoulder as if it were a bag of feathers. He carried it to the storeroom, his boots making solid, reassuring thuds on the wooden floorboards. When he returned, he saw Silas squinting at a loose pane of glass in the front window. which rattled every time the wind blew. "That has been threatening to fall out for a month," Silas said with a sigh. "I can fix that," Jonah said. He found the tools he needed in the back, and for the next hour, he worked. Eliza watched him from behind the counter as she sorted a new shipment of sewing needles and thread. She watched his hands. They were not a gunslinger's hands, though she had no doubt they were fast. They were the hands of a man who worked. The palms were broad and deeply calloused. The knuckles were white with old scars, and the fingers, though long, were thick and strong. He worked with a patient, methodical grace, removing the old, dried putty, setting the glass firmly back in its frame, and applying a new, clean line of sealant. He did not rush. He did not waste a single movement. There was a discipline in him, a quiet intensity that she found both unsettling and deeply compelling. He was a man who knew how to build, how to mend. The thought was a dangerous one. In the afternoon, the store grew quiet. It was time for her lessons. Her school was not a formal affair. It was held in the back storeroom, where a space had been cleared between barrels of pickles and crates of tinned peaches. Her half-dozen students, the children of ranchers and the blacksmith, sat on upended crates, their faces scrubbed and earnest. Eliza believed that ignorance was a greater threat to Dry Willow than any outlaw band, and that teaching a child to read was a revolutionary act. She used the charred side of a wooden plank as a blackboard. She said, chalking the letter with a graceful sweep of her hand. The first letter, like the start of a new day. The children repeated it in a chorus of high, reedy voices. She guided their small fingers, helped them form the letters on their own small slates. She was patient, her voice soft but firm. And in this small, dusty room, she was not just a storekeeper's daughter. She was a force of change, a nurturer of futures. She did not know he was watching until she felt the subtle shift in the light. Jonah stood just outside the open storeroom door, leaning against the frame, his arms crossed over his chest. He was in the shadows, his face unreadable, but he was listening. He was watching her in this world she had made for herself, a world he had never been a part of. A flush rose on her cheeks, but she did not falter. She continued the lesson, her voice steady, acutely aware of the silent, powerful presence just beyond the circle of her students. When the lesson was over and the children had been dismissed with a peppermint stick each, he was gone. But the feeling of being seen, truly seen, lingered long after. The whispers began that same afternoon. It started, as these things often did, as a murmur in the saloon, where Sheriff Pike bought a round of drinks. A quiet word here, a regretful shake of the head there, a mention of a telegraph he had received concerning a man named Cole, and an unfortunate incident involving firearms in a Dodge City saloon. By the time the sun began to sink, the story had grown legs. Another name was added to the whispers, a woman's name, Rosa Delgado, a widow, they said, from near Santa Fe, a story about a ranch that was no longer hers, and how Jonah Cole had been the one to ride away with the deed in his pocket. Eliza heard it when Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, came in for a spool of thread and spoke in hushed tones, her eyes darting toward the stairs that led to the attic room. She felt it in the way old man Hemlock, who usually had a joke for her, just nodded curtly and left without a word. The shadows of rumor were long and cold, and they were creeping into the warm, safe confines of her store. That evening, just as she was about to lock the front door, Sheriff Pike appeared. He was freshly shaven, and the scent of bay rum preceded him. "Good evening, Eliza," he said, his smile confident. I was hoping to have a word. He stepped inside, his presence seeming to shrink the room. "As you know, the town council has approved my proposal to start a public library. A town with a railroad coming needs a library. It is a mark of civilization." "I agree." "Sheriff, it is a fine idea," Eliza said, her hand still on the lock. "We are having a small gathering at the hotel this Saturday. A fundraiser, music, some food. A respectable affair for a respectable town," he said, his eyes flicking upward for a moment. I would be honored if you would allow me to escort you. Your presence would lend a great deal of weight to the cause. It was a public claim, a way of placing his brand on her. He was offering her his protection, his social standing, a place at his side in the new, civilized dry willow he was building. And it was a clear warning to the man upstairs. She understood it all in an instant. "That is very kind of you, Sheriff," she said, forcing a polite smile. "But with my father's health and the demands of the store, I so rarely go out in the evenings. I will be happy to make a donation. Of course, I believe in the cause." Pike's smile tightened at the edges. He was not a man who took rejection well. "A shame," he said, "but I understand duty." He paused, his gaze hardening slightly. "Just be sure you know where your duty lies. Eliza, some things and some people are not worth the trouble they bring." He left, and Eliza locked the door behind him, the heavy bolt sliding home with a loud thud. The store was dark, filled with the familiar shapes of her life. But tonight, they seemed different, shadowed by doubt. Later, long after Silas had gone to bed, she found Jonah in the kitchen. He was sitting at the small wooden table, cleaning his pistol with a quiet, focused intensity. The lamplight gleamed on the polished steel and cast his face in sharp relief. He looked up as she entered. She did not sit down. She stood by the stove, her arms wrapped around herself as if against a chill. The oil lamp on the table cast a small circle of golden light that pushed back the shadows but could not banish them entirely. "They are saying things," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "In town, about you." Jonah did not flinch. He carefully placed a newly oiled cylinder back into the frame of the revolver and looked at her, his dark eyes steady. "What are they saying?" "Eliza. About Dodge City, about a shooting, and about a woman, Rosa Delgado." He set the gun down on the table, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not deny it. His silence was worse than any denial. In that quiet moment, her mother's story rose up in her memory like a ghost. Her mother had also loved a charming man with a past, a man who had spun beautiful words that turned to dust, leaving her with a broken heart and a duty she could not fulfill. Eliza had sworn she would never make that mistake. She would be sensible. She would be strong. "There have been 3 times in my life I have had to draw my gun on another man," Jonah said, his voice low and steady, cutting through her thoughts. He looked not at her, but at his own calloused hands, resting on the tabletop. "The first was in Dodge, a card game. The man I was playing against was cheating. When I called him on it, he pulled a knife. I shot the knife out of his hand. I did not shoot him." He paused, and the only sound was the faint hiss of the lamp. "The second time was on a cattle drive. A man tried to steal my horse. A good horse is a man's life out there. I warned him. He did not listen. I shot him in the leg. He lived." He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers. There was no apology in his eyes, only a deep, abiding weariness. "And Rosa Delgado?" she asked, the name feeling strange on her lips. "Her husband was a good man." Jonah said, "He was my partner. We bought a piece of land together near Santa Fe. He took sick and passed away, leaving Rosa with 2 small children and a mountain of debt. The banker in town tried to take the land from her for pennies on the dollar. He sent men to frighten her off. I was the 3rd man. I was there when they came. They drew on me. I did not miss." He let out a long, slow breath. "I did not take her ranch. Eliza, I paid off her husband's debts, my partner's debts, and gave her a fair price for her half, a price that let her move to town and open a dress shop. She is doing well. She is married again." He had told his side. The words hung in the space between them, plain and unadorned. They had the ring of truth, but Eliza knew that the truth was a slippery thing. It could be shaped and twisted. Pike's version was simpler, cleaner, a drifter with a violent past, preying on a widow. It was a story the town could easily understand. She wanted to believe Jonah, a part of her, the girl who had carved a heart in a cottonwood tree. desperately wanted to believe him. But the woman who ran a business, who cared for an aging father, who had seen the bitter consequences of a misplaced heart, was more cautious. She kept her distance. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice formal. She turned to leave, to retreat to the safety of her own room. "Eliza," he called after her, his voice rough. She stopped, but did not turn around. "Honor is not what people say about you in the light. It is what you do in the dark, when no one is watching." She stood there for a long moment, her back to him. The small lamp on the table fought against the encroaching darkness of the kitchen. It was a fragile light, she thought, easily extinguished by a sudden gust of wind, or a carefully whispered lie. She said nothing, and finally walked away, leaving him alone in the circle of its lonely glow. The true business of Dry Willow was not conducted over the counters of its shops or in the pews of its church, but in the cool, quiet office of the Holloway Bank. Mr. Elias Holloway was a man whose softness was his armor. His hands were plump and white, his suit was always impeccably brushed, and his voice never rose above a soothing murmur. He dealt not in lead and leather, but in futures, in the invisible lines on maps that would soon become iron rails and land grants. Behind his polished desk, a large, detailed map of the Arizona Territory was pinned to the wall. On it, a faint pencil line snaked its way toward Dry Willow, tracing the proposed route of the railroad. The line ran directly along the north bank of the Willow Creek, through a stretch of arid, seemingly worthless scrubland that, for the past 6 months, Mr. Holloway had been patiently, quietly acquiring. He used proxies, men from out of town who made offers to the few ranchers with claims out that way. He used the law, finding obscure faults in old titles. And he used fear, a commodity Sheriff Pike was adept at managing. Pike kept the town orderly, ensuring that any ranchers who got stubborn found themselves beset by unusual misfortune, a fence cut, a well fouled, a persistent and unnerving sense of being watched. The partnership was a simple one. Holloway provided the capital and the vision, Pike provided the muscle, wrapped in the authority of a tin star. Miles from town, under that same unforgiving sun, Jonah Cole was discovering the subtle signature of their work. He had ridden out to the modest spread he was starting, a piece of land bordering New Mexico that he had bought with 18 years of hard-earned savings. As he checked his fence line, he saw it, a boundary marker, a heavy wooden stake driven deep into the earth, had been moved. It was not a subtle shift. It had been pulled up and driven back into the ground a full 20 yards inside his property line. It was a crude, arrogant theft of acreage, a silent provocation. He dismounted, his jaw tight with a cold fury. He ran his calloused hand over the splintered top of the stake. This was not the work of a careless neighbor. This was a message. Later that day, a rider approached his camp. A wiry, sun-baked man with a thoughtful face and eyes that missed nothing. This was Mateo Vargas, the foreman Jonah had hired, a man whose loyalty he had earned on a long drive years before. "Jonah," Mateo said, swinging down from his horse. "Trouble." "I found it," Jonah said, gesturing to the moved stake. "It is more than that," Mateo said, his voice low. "I have seen them. 2 men. They do not ride like cowhands. They watch the ranch from the high ridge. They have been there for 2 days. They carry new rifles." He paused. "And their horses are shod with shoes from the Holloway Bank's livery." Jonah looked at the distant ridge, a dark line against the bright sky. The shadows were gathering, not just in whispers in town, but out here, on the land itself. The line of morality in Dry Willow was as easily moved as a wooden stake. The next afternoon, the town council convened in the courthouse, a stuffy room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and old paper. Eliza sat straight-backed on a hard wooden bench, waiting for her turn to speak. Holloway was there, as was Sheriff Pike, and a handful of other merchants and ranchers who constituted the town's leadership. "And now," the mayor said, a portly man who owned the hotel, "Miss Hart has a proposal concerning the new library fund." Eliza stood, her hands clasped in front of her. She was not intimidated by these men. She had been taking their measure across her store counter for years. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and steady, "as we look toward the future, toward the growth the railroad will bring, we must invest not only in our businesses, but in our minds. I propose we allocate a portion of the town's surplus to purchase a starter collection of books. Emerson, Thoreau, Shakespeare, books of science and history, to be made available to every citizen of Dry Willow." A murmur went through the room. It was a fine sentiment, but Holloway's man, a rancher named Cobb who had recently sold his North Bank holdings at a very favorable price, cleared his throat. "Miss Hart, that is a noble idea," he said, his tone condescending. "But the roof on this very courthouse is leaking. The last rain we had, it ruined a stack of legal documents. Seems to me we ought to fix what is broken before we start buying poetry books." Holloway nodded in slow, deliberate agreement. Pragmatism. Gentlemen, that is what built the West. Eliza felt a familiar surge of frustration, but she did not let it show. Arguing would get her nowhere. She had to balance the scales. "Mr. Cobb makes an excellent point," she said, her tone reasonable and calm, which surprised them. "A leaky roof is a problem that affects us all. It must be our first priority. Let us commission the repairs immediately." She paused, letting them absorb her agreement. "And while the carpenter is working, perhaps he could build us a single, sturdy bookshelf. And with the money we save by using local lumber, we could purchase a dozen books, not a library. Perhaps, just to start. A promise to ourselves that we can mend our roofs and feed our minds at the same time." Her logic was inescapable. To refuse would make them look both foolish and miserly. Holloway gave a tight, thin-lipped smile, bested by a woman's quiet sense. The motion passed. Eliza had not won a library, but she had won a bookshelf, and that, she knew, was how real change began. On Sunday, after Preacher Whitcomb had delivered a stern sermon on the evils of greed, the congregation spilled out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. Sheriff Pike made his way to Eliza's side as she was speaking with Ivy Monroe, the new schoolteacher from the East who had become her fast friend. "A fine sermon," Pike said, touching the brim of his hat. He positioned himself just a little too close to Eliza. A subtle act of possession. "I hope you will take it to heart. Eliza, there is a great deal of wickedness in this world." He glanced out toward the edge of town. "I hear talk you have been riding out alone. I would advise against it. Sable Jack's men have been seen again. A lady should not wander too far from the safety of town." His eyes held hers, and the warning was not just about outlaws. It was about Jonah. It was about her own independence. "Stay put, stay safe, stay mine." The possessiveness in his gaze made her skin crawl. It was the same look he gave his prize horse, the same look Holloway gave his maps. It was the look of a man who saw the world as a collection of things to be owned. That afternoon, the clouds began to gather on the horizon, great purple bruises against the turquoise sky. The air grew heavy, charged with the promise of the first rains of the season. A restless energy settled over the town and over Eliza. Jonah found her in the storeroom, checking the inventory in her ledger. He had been quiet and distant since his foreman's visit, a darkness in his eyes that worried her. "The sky is turning," he said, his voice low. He stood in the doorway, much as he had done during her lesson, a figure caught between light and shadow. "I need to ride out, to clear my head." He hesitated for a moment. "There is a place I remember, a hidden spring, up in the canyons. We used to call it our oasis." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She remembered a secret place, a trickle of cool water that emerged from the red rock, nourishing a small grove of cottonwood trees, a place of childhood dreams and whispered promises. They had not been there together since they were 10 years old. "I remember," she said softly. "Ride with me, Eliza," he said. It was not a demand. It was a plea, a request to reconnect with a past that was simpler, a time before long miles and hard truths had separated them. Pike's warning echoed in her ears. Her own sensible mind told her it was foolish, reckless. The town was watching. The sky was threatening. But one look at Jonah's face, at the troubled lines around his eyes and the deep-seated loneliness she saw there, and her caution crumbled. She needed to clear her head, too. She needed to escape the suffocating confines of the town, of the rumors, of Pike's watchful eyes. "I will get my horse," she said. The ride out of Dry Willow felt like a liberation. The creak of the saddle leather, the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves on the hard-packed earth, the vast, open sky above them. It was a language she had almost forgotten. They did not speak much at first, content to let the silence of the desert envelop them. Jonah led the way, his back straight, his seat in the saddle easy and natural. He rode like a man who was a part of the landscape, not just a traveler passing through it. They left the dusty flats behind and entered the winding canyons, the red rock walls rising up on either side of them, carved into fantastical shapes by centuries of wind and water. The air grew cooler here, in the shadows of the cliffs. He led her through a narrow passage she would never have found on her own. And then, the canyon opened up into a small, hidden bowl. It was just as she remembered, the cottonwood trees, their leaves a vibrant green against the red rock, rustled in the rising wind. A narrow ribbon of water, clear and cold, flowed from a fissure in the cliff face, pooling in a shallow basin before disappearing into the sandy earth. It was a place of impossible life in the middle of a world of stone and sun. They dismounted, letting the horses drink from the pool. "It has not changed," she said, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "Some things do not," he replied, his eyes on her. He walked over to one of the older cottonwoods, the one whose roots clung to the edge of the spring. He ran his hand over the rough bark, searching. "It was here," he murmured. She came to stand beside him. She saw it then, faint and nearly consumed by the healing bark. J+E. The lopsided heart was almost gone, but the letters were still there, a ghost of a childhood promise. "We were going to build our ranch right here," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "Raise horses. You said we would have the fastest horses in the territory." "I remember," he said. He turned to face her, the troubled look returning to his eyes. "Eliza, the man who moved my boundary marker, the men watching my land, this is about more than just a few acres of scrub. It is about this water. This is the only reliable spring for miles. It feeds the underground water table for the whole north bank." The pieces began to click into place in her mind. The railroad, Holloway's sudden interest in worthless land, Pike's desire for order. "The railroad needs water for its engines," she breathed, the enormity of it settling upon her. "Whoever controls this spring controls the value of all the land along the north bank. And they are trying to squeeze me out, to take it," he finished, his voice grim. A sudden, powerful gust of wind tore through the canyon, whipping Eliza's hair across her face and making the cottonwood leaves clap together like 1,000 tiny hands. The sky, which had been a bruised purple, was now the color of slate. The light in the canyon dimmed, and a low rumble echoed off the rock walls. Jonah looked up at the sky, his expression hardening with concern. "The rain is coming, and it is coming fast. We have to go, now." The peace of their oasis was shattered. The premonition of the storm was now a certainty. As they scrambled to mount their horses, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the dry earth and raising the scent of wet dust and sage. The coming storm was no longer a distant threat on the horizon. It was upon them, a raw and violent force of nature, and they were miles from the safety of town, alone together in the heart of the wild. The first crack of thunder was a physical blow, a deafening explosion that seemed to split the sky directly overhead. The rain, which had begun as fat, lazy drops, transformed in an instant into a torrential downpour, a solid, blinding sheet of water that turned the narrow canyon floor into a churning river of red mud. The horses panicked, whinnying and sidestepping, their eyes wide with fear. This way, Jonah's voice was a roar, barely audible over the storm's fury. He grabbed the reins of Eliza's horse, his face a mask of grim urgency. "The creek will flash. We have to get to higher ground." He urged them not back the way they came, but deeper into a narrow side canyon, a place that looked like a dead end. Water was already pouring down the rock faces in slick, brown waterfalls. Eliza could feel the cold seeping through her dress, her boots filling with icy water. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. This was the desert's other face, not the slow, baking death of the sun, but the sudden, violent death of the flood. Just as she thought the sheer rock walls would close in on them, Jonah veered sharply, guiding them behind a massive slab of fallen rock that leaned against the cliff. Behind it was a dark opening, the mouth of a shallow cave, barely large enough for them and the two terrified horses. They stumbled inside, out of the direct path of the deluge, the sound of the storm instantly muffled to a constant, thunderous roar. For a long moment, they both just stood there in the dripping gloom, chests heaving, the smell of wet horse and rain-soaked earth filling the small space. Water streamed from Eliza's hair and clothes, forming a puddle at her feet. She was shivering, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that shook her entire body. "Are you all right?" Jonah asked, his voice tight with concern. He moved closer, his hands hovering as if he wanted to touch her but did not dare. "Just cold," she managed to chatter through her teeth. He nodded, his eyes scanning the interior of their refuge. The cave was shallow, but it sloped upward at the back. A faint, sulphurous smell hung in the air, and she could see a ghostly white mist curling from a fissure in the rock at the very rear of the cave. "Wait here," he commanded. He moved toward the mist, disappearing into the darkness. She heard the scrape of his boots on rock, then a quiet exclamation. He returned a moment later, his face illuminated by a strange, new resolve. "I know this place. There is a hot spring, a small one, feeding a pool in the back. It will warm you." The idea of warmth was the most seductive thing she had ever imagined. She followed him, her numb feet stumbling over the uneven floor. The back of the cave opened into a small, enclosed grotto, no bigger than her father's storeroom. A pool of water, perfectly clear and still, bubbled gently in the center, sending clouds of steam into the cool air. The warmth was immediate, a blessed relief that seemed to soak into her very bones. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," Jonah said, his voice practical, his back already turned to her as he began to unsaddle the horses. "You will catch your death." He was right, but the thought of it made a hot blush rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the steam. Propriety. The carefully constructed walls of her reputation seemed absurd in the face of a flash flood and chattering teeth. Yet the habits of a lifetime were hard to break. "There is a ledge back here," he said, sensing her hesitation without looking at her. "Behind that big rock, I will stay with the horses. Your privacy will be respected. Eliza." The quiet sincerity in his voice shamed her. She nodded, though he could not see it, and picked her way over the rocks to the sheltered spot he had indicated. It was a small alcove, shielded from the entrance of the cave. With fumbling, frozen fingers, she unbuttoned her sodden dress. The heavy, wet wool peeled away from her skin, and she was left in her chemise and petticoats, which were just as soaked. Shivering violently now, she hung the dress over a sharp outcrop of rock, hoping the steam would dry it. She used her heavy riding cloak, which was thankfully only damp on the outside, to wrap around herself, clutching it tightly at her throat. The warmth from the pool was a tantalizing promise. She waited, listening to the roar of the rain outside and the gentle sounds of Jonah moving about, his voice a low murmur as he calmed the horses. The steam swirled around her, warm and thick, obscuring everything in a soft, white veil. The world was reduced to this small, warm, secret place. A sudden, violent gust of wind, a freak whirlwind born of the storm's fury, howled through the cave entrance. It tore through the grotto with a physical force, a malevolent spirit of the storm. It ripped the heavy wool dress from the rock and sent it sailing into the darkness. Before Eliza could even cry out, the same gust caught her cloak, whipping it from her grasp and flinging it away. She was left standing, exposed, with nothing but the swirling steam to cover her. For a panicked, heart-stopping second, she froze, then, disoriented, thinking only of retrieving her cloak, she took a clumsy step out from behind the rock and found herself standing directly in front of him. Jonah had turned at the sound of the wind. He stood absolutely still, as if he had been turned to stone. His eyes were wide, his face a mask of shock. In that instant, the world stopped. The roar of the rain faded. The chattering of her own teeth ceased. There was only the thick white steam coiling around them, and the stunned, silent space between them. He saw her, all of her, a woman's body, pale and trembling in the mist, a sight no man had ever seen. Her mind went completely blank, then flooded with a heat that was far more intense than the steam, a mortification so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. She wanted the rock floor to open up and claim her. She wanted to cease to exist. But Jonah did not move. He did not look away. Not at first. His gaze was not hungry or possessive like Pike's would have been. It was filled with a raw, unguarded awe, a reverence that was so unexpected it stole her breath. Then, as if breaking a powerful spell, he blinked. He wrenched his eyes away, fixing them on the far wall of the cave. His entire body went rigid with the effort of control. His hands, which had been hanging loosely at his sides, clenched into tight fists. With a swift, fluid motion, he shrugged out of his own dry buckskin coat. He did not step toward her. He held it out, his arm outstretched, his face still turned resolutely away. The gesture, so full of honor and restraint, broke through her panic. She stumbled forward, her skin burning, and snatched the coat from his hand, pulling it around her shoulders. It was warm from his body and smelled of leather and horse and him. It was the most comforting thing she had ever felt. She stood there, clutching the coat, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had to say something. She had to break the terrible, charged silence. The words that came out were a strangled, ridiculous whisper. A virgin who came naked, by mistake, of course. A choked sound came from his throat. It might have been a laugh or a groan of pain. He finally turned his head, though he did not look directly at her. His eyes focused somewhere near her shoulder. His voice, when he spoke, was a raw, hoarse rasp she barely recognized. "My hands might freeze. Cat," he said, using a childhood nickname she had not heard in 18 years. A name he had given her because she was always so quiet and watchful. But my heart did not. And then the dam of her composure, of 18 years of carefully guarded emotions, finally broke. A sob escaped her, a ragged, helpless sound, and in that moment, all the space between them vanished. He was there, his arms coming around her, pulling her against his chest, holding her tight as the shudders racked her body. He did not kiss her. He did not try to take advantage of her vulnerability. He just held her, his hand stroking her wet hair, his body a solid, warm anchor in the swirling chaos of the storm and her own emotions. It was not an embrace of passion, but of profound, aching tenderness, of protection, of a promise kept. She leaned into him, burying her face in the rough fabric of his shirt, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt completely safe. When her sobs subsided, she did not pull away. Instead, she lifted her head and looked into his eyes. She saw her own reflection there, and behind it, a depth of feeling that mirrored her own. Without thinking, she reached up and took his hand. Her fingers lacing through his hand was rough and calloused, but his grip was gentle. "I want to try," she whispered, the words tasting of salt and rain. "For this future, with you." A look of incredible relief, so profound it was almost painful to witness, washed over his face. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Eliza," he breathed, her name a prayer. They stood like that for a long time, listening to the rain as it began to soften, its roar diminishing to a steady, rhythmic drumming. The storm was passing. As the light outside began to strengthen, a fragile gray replacing the black, Jonah reluctantly released her. "We should check the damage," he said, his voice still thick with emotion. "See if the canyon is passable." He went to the cave entrance, and she followed. Still wrapped in the warm cocoon of his coat, the world outside was washed clean, the red rock gleaming, the air sharp and new. The flash flood had subsided, leaving a trail of debris on the canyon floor. As he scanned the path, something in the mud near the entrance to their grotto caught his eye. He knelt down, his expression hardening. Eliza came to stand beside him. There, pressed deep into the wet, red earth, were the clear, sharp prints of a horseshoe. It was a fresh print, made just before the worst of the rain had hit, and on the shoe was a small, distinctive mark, a maker's stamp, a capital H enclosed in a circle. "Holloway," she whispered, her blood running cold. "That is the brand from the Holloway Bank's livery." Jonah touched the edge of the print with his finger. "They were not watching my land from the ridge," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "They were watching this spring. They followed us here." The intimacy and warmth of their shelter evaporated, replaced by a chilling realization. They were not just fighting against whispers and greedy land grabs. They were fighting an enemy who operated in the shadows, who had hired men to watch, to intimidate, and to follow. The evidence was right here, at their feet, a silent testament to the conspiracy tightening its grip on Dry Willow. The shared danger solidified the promise they had just made to each other. It was no longer a dream of a future. It had become a fight for one. The ride back to Dry Willow was a silent, taut affair. The world, washed clean by the storm, seemed unnaturally bright, every detail sharp and threatening. The hoofprint in the mud was a brand on Eliza's mind, a physical seal on the conspiracy that had, until now, been a thing of whispers and shadows. Jonah rode beside her, his easy posture gone, replaced by a coiled, watchful stillness. They were no longer just a man and a woman who shared a past. They were partners who had stumbled into a war. They arrived back in town in the early afternoon. The streets were quiet, the townsfolk moving slowly, recovering from the sudden violence of the storm. Eliza went straight to the back room of the mercantile to prepare for her lesson. The familiar routine, a welcome anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. Ivy Monroe was already there, wiping down the slate blackboard. "That was some storm," Ivy said, her cheerful Boston accent a stark contrast to the grim tension of the desert. "I thought the roof was going to fly away." "It was," Eliza said, her voice distant. She tried to focus on the children, on the simple, clean lines of the alphabet, but the image of the hoofprint, of Holloway's mark, kept intruding. The lesson had just begun. The small chorus of children reciting their letters, when the first faint smell of smoke drifted through the open storeroom door. It was thin at first, easily mistaken for a cooking fire, but it grew stronger, acrid and resinous. It was the smell of pine lumber burning. A man's shout echoed from the street, sharp with alarm. "Fire! The lumber yard is on fire!" Chaos erupted. Ivy's face went pale. The lumber yard was less than 100 yards away, separated from the back of the mercantile only by a dusty alleyway. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, was picking up, pushing the smoke and the threat directly toward them. "Children!" Quickly now Eliza's voice cut through the rising panic, sharp and commanding. "Hold hands. We are going out the front. Ivy, take the lead." She and Ivy moved with practiced efficiency, their fear masked by a calm they did not feel. They shepherded the frightened, crying children through the store, where Silas was already pulling the heavy wooden shutters across the front windows. "Get them to the church. Eliza, He yelled over the growing roar from outside. "It is Brick. They will be safe there." As Eliza pushed the last child out the door, she saw it. The sky to the east was filled with a billowing cloud of black smoke, shot through with an angry orange glow. But it was the sound from the other end of the street that made her blood run cold. Gunshots. Not one or two, but a volley. A sharp, cracking fusillade that was not the sound of a drunken dispute. It was the sound of an organized attack. The fire was a diversion. Her eyes darted through the swirling smoke and dust. Searching, then she saw him. Jonah. He was not running from the fire. He was on his horse, galloping straight through the center of the panicked crowd. His face set like granite. He was not shouting an alarm. He was issuing commands. "The bank! They are hitting the bank!" he roared, his voice cutting through the din. "Take cover. Get the women and children inside." He reined his horse to a skidding halt near the courthouse, swinging down from the saddle before the animal had even stopped moving. Several townsmen, shaken out of their stupor by the force of his command, ran to join him. "We need a barricade," Jonah yelled, pointing to a long, heavy watering trough. "Now tip it over in that wagon." Eliza, her heart in her throat after seeing Ivy and the children safely on their way to the church, turned back to her father. "Bolt the door." "Father." "I already have," Silas said, his old eyes grim. He held a heavy shotgun in his hands. "This is not a random act. Daughter, this has the stink of purpose." From the narrow window beside the door, Eliza watched the scene unfold. Jonah was a whirlwind of motion, a natural leader in the chaos. Under his direction, the watering trough was heaved onto its side. A buckboard wagon was rolled into place, its wheels chocked. It was a flimsy defense, a desperate measure, but it was something. It was a line being drawn. The raiders, a half-dozen of them, were focused on the bank, firing into the windows, their faces obscured by bandanas. They moved with a reckless confidence, as if they expected no resistance. The sudden, organized defense from Jonah and the townsmen clearly surprised them. A rifle cracked from behind the makeshift barricade. One of the raiders spun around, clutching his arm, and scrambled for cover. The street became a no-man's land of flying lead and splintering wood. Sheriff Pike appeared, running from his office with his pistol drawn, his face a mixture of shock and fury. He took a position near the corner of the hotel, firing 2 quick shots before ducking back. Jonah was calm in the heart of the storm. He was not firing wildly. He was directing the others, pointing out targets, conserving their ammunition. He moved from one end of the barricade to the other, a low, crouching run, reloading his pistol as he went. Then Eliza saw a puff of dust and splinters explode from the edge of the watering trough, just inches from Jonah's head. He flinched, not from the near miss, but from something else. He stumbled, his hand going to his side, and a dark stain began to spread across the pale fabric of his shirt. A cry escaped her lips. He was hit. He staggered, but did not fall. He leaned against the wagon for a moment, his jaw clenched, and then he raised his pistol and fired again. The fight was short and brutal. The raiders, having met a resistance they had not anticipated and with the whole town now aroused, began to fall back. They grabbed the sacks of money from the bank and ran for their horses. As they fled, one of them, slower than the others, cut through the alleyway beside the mercantile. Jonah saw him, pushing himself off the wagon, ignoring his wound. He sprinted after him. Eliza watched in horror as the 2 men disappeared into the smoke-filled alley. Moments later, the shooting stopped. The remaining raiders spurred their horses out of town, leaving behind the smoke, the shattered glass, and the ringing silence. Sheriff Pike, clutching a bloody shoulder, was shouting orders, his voice raw with anger. Eliza's attention was fixed on the alley. She threw the bolt on the door and ran outside, her senses overwhelmed by the acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder. She found them halfway down the alley. The raider was on the ground, groaning, a fresh bruise on his jaw. Jonah stood over him, his pistol in one hand, His other hand pressed tightly against his bleeding side. His face was pale, beaded with sweat, but his eyes were blazing with a cold fire. "Get inside," he grunted at her. "It is over." She ignored him. "You are hurt," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She took his arm. "Come on, inside, now!" He did not resist. He allowed her to lead him back into the store, leaning on her more heavily with each step. Silas met them at the door, his face a mask of worry. "Just a scratch." "Silas," Jonah said, though the words were a clear lie. Eliza led him behind the long oak counter, into the relative privacy of her workspace. "Sit," she commanded, pushing a stool toward him. "Take off your shirt." He sank onto the stool, his breathing shallow. He pulled the torn, bloody shirt over his head, wincing as the fabric pulled at the wound. It was not a scratch. It was a deep, raw graze along his ribs, bleeding freely. Her hands were shaking. She took a deep breath, forcing them to be still. She remembered her mother tending to her father's injuries, her movements always calm and sure. Eliza would be the same. She grabbed a clean cloth from a stack of linen, a bottle of the strongest whiskey they sold, and a roll of bandages. "This will sting," she warned, her voice low. She poured the whiskey directly onto the cloth, and then, taking another steadying breath, she pressed it against the wound. Jonah hissed, his whole body going rigid, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the counter. But he did not make another sound. She worked quickly, her fear channeled into a fierce, protective focus. She cleaned the wound with a merciless efficiency, her touch surprisingly gentle as she wrapped the clean white bandage tightly around his chest, creating a thick, absorbent pad over the injury. As she tied the final knot, her steady hands faltered, and she had to brace herself against the counter, a wave of delayed shock washing over her. Jonah's hand covered hers. His skin was cool, his grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you, Eliza," he said, his voice quiet. The bell above the door chimed violently, and Sheriff Pike strode in, his left arm in a crude sling, his face livid. Several townsmen followed him in, their faces grim. Cole Pike's voice was a whip crack. What in the hell was that? His eyes fell on the captured raider, who Jonah had dragged inside and tied to a chair. You brought this on us. Dry Willow was a peaceful town until you rode in." Jonah slowly rose to his feet, the fresh white bandage a stark contrast to the grime and blood on his skin. It was a badge of honor, the price he had paid while the sheriff had been taking cover. "This was not my doing." "Pike," Jonah said, his voice dangerously low. "This was planned." Planned by who? Pike scoffed. Sablejack is an animal, not a general. "He had help," Jonah said. He walked over to the captured raider and reached into the man's vest pocket. He pulled out a folded, crumpled piece of paper. He smoothed it out on the counter. Next to the brass scale, it was a promissory note, a loan document for $100. It was signed at the bottom by the raider, and it was issued on the official letterhead of the Holloway Bank. A collective gasp went through the small crowd of men. Pike stared at the paper, his face draining of all color. The proof was undeniable. The implications were staggering. Pike's fury, born of fear and guilt, finally found its target. He turned on Jonah, his good hand pointing a shaking finger. "You see, it is you. You come into town with some story about a grudge against Holloway. You bring this trouble down on us all just to settle some personal score." The accusation was absurd, a desperate attempt to deflect the damning evidence that lay on the counter. The townsmen looked from Pike to Jonah, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning suspicion. Their world had been turned upside down in the space of an hour. They did not know who to trust. Eliza stepped out from behind the counter. She moved to stand beside Jonah, a small, unmovable rock in the swirling currents of chaos and accusation. She faced the sheriff, her gray eyes clear and unafraid. "The trouble is not him." "Sheriff," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent store. "The trouble is in Mr. Holloway's safe." The air in Dry Willow in the days following the raid was thick with a silence more menacing than the gunshots had been. The fire at the lumberyard was out, leaving a blackened, skeletal ruin that smelled of char and regret. The bank was boarded up, a testament to the town's violated security. But the deepest damage was invisible. Trust, the invisible mortar that held the small community together, had been shattered. The promissory note from Holloway's bank lay locked in the sheriff's desk, a piece of evidence that Pike both could not ignore and dared not act upon. The town was split. Some, loyal to the established order, followed Pike's lead, blaming the violence on Jonah, the outsider who had disturbed their fragile peace. Others, who had long harbored a quiet distrust of Elias Holloway's smooth manners and acquisitive nature, looked at Jonah with a new respect. They had seen him organize a defense while the sheriff was still drawing his pistol. They had seen him take a bullet meant for their town. He was a man of action, not just words, but they were the quieter faction, and fear kept their voices low. Jonah moved through this charged atmosphere with a quiet purpose. The bandage around his ribs was a constant, sharp reminder of the fight that was to come. He said little about the raid, letting the promissory note speak for itself. He spent his days helping Silas repair a section of warped floorboards in the mercantile, the simple, honest work a balm to his restless energy. But at night, Eliza would see him sitting by the kitchen window, staring out at the darkened town, his face a hard mask in the lamplight. He was waiting. Eliza felt the town's division acutely. Customers who had known her since she was a girl now met her eyes with a flicker of suspicion before looking away. Others would press her hand across the counter, a silent gesture of support. She felt as though she were living on a fault line, the ground beneath her ready to split open. Her faith in Jonah was no longer a tentative hope. It was a fierce, protective certainty forged in the chaos of the raid and the quiet intimacy of tending to his wound. But she knew that her faith was not enough. The whispers about Rosa Delgado still clung to him like burrs, a convenient poison for Pike to drip into the town's bloodstream. Truth, she was learning, was not a self-evident force. It was a fragile seed that had to be planted, watered, and defended from the blight of lies. The defense arrived on the back of a tired horse 4 days after the raid. A rider, caked in the dust of the Santa Fe Trail, dismounted in front of the livery and asked for a man named Mateo Vargas. Mateo, who had been staying in town since the trouble started, met the rider and was handed a thick, sealed envelope. He took it straight to the mercantile. He found Jonah and Eliza in the kitchen, sharing a silent cup of coffee before the start of the day. Mateo placed the envelope on the table without a word. It was addressed to Jonah in a neat, feminine hand. Jonah picked it up, his expression unreadable. He broke the wax seal with his thumb and unfolded the letter inside. A second, more official-looking document was tucked within its folds. He read it, and Eliza watched as the tension that had held his shoulders rigid for days seemed to dissolve. A long, slow breath escaped his lips. He looked up, and his eyes, when they met hers, were clear and bright with a profound relief. "It is from Rosa," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He handed the letter across the table to Eliza. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it. The letter was written on fine stationery, the ink a steady, confident blue. "My dearest Jonah," it began. "Your man, Mateo, found me well, though his message brought me great worry for you. I pray this letter finds you safe. I was deeply saddened to hear that old lies have followed you to Dry Willow. Let me state the truth plainly, so that no man of honor can doubt it. My late husband, God rest his soul, considered you his brother. After his passing, when the banker sought to prey upon a widow's grief, you were my shield. You drove off the men he sent, and you faced down his greed. You did not steal our ranch. You purchased my share for a price far more generous than I had any right to expect, a price that allowed me to bring my children to Santa Fe and build a new life. I am happy here. Jonah, I have a small but successful dressmaking shop. 6 months ago, I married a good man, a blacksmith named Samuel. We are expecting our first child in the spring. Your honor and your kindness gave me this second chance at happiness. And I will not have your name slandered by wicked men. I have enclosed a sworn statement, witnessed and sealed by the municipal clerk of Santa Fe, attesting to these facts. Use it to silence the snakes in that town. Be safe, my friend. Some debts can never be repaid, but know that my family and I will remember ours to you for all our days. With deepest gratitude, Rosa Delgado Jones. Eliza looked up from the letter, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Tucked inside was the affidavit, its formal legal language confirming every word Rosa had written, bearing the undeniable, embossed seal of the Santa Fe courthouse. The truth, she whispered. It felt like a holy thing in her hands. The next day was Sunday. The town gathered at the church, a weekly ritual of piety and social communion. They came to pray for guidance, to see and be seen, and to trade the week's news in hushed tones after the service. Holloway was in his usual pew near the front, looking composed and pious. Sheriff Pike stood by the door, his arm still in a sling, his expression a careful mixture of authority and pained concern for his flock. After Preacher Whitcomb's final amen, as the congregation began to stir, Eliza stood up. She was not a woman who sought the spotlight, and a hush fell over the church as every eye turned to her. Jonah stood beside her, his presence a silent, solid support. "Preacher," she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating in the quiet space. "Before we depart, I ask for a moment of the town's time. A matter of public honor needs to be addressed in a public forum." The preacher, a man who valued peace above all else, looked flustered, but he nodded his assent. Eliza walked to the front of the church, the 2 letters held firmly in her hand. She stood before the altar, facing the sea of familiar, uncertain faces. She saw doubt, curiosity, and in some, a hostile resentment. She met their gazes without flinching. She looked directly at Sheriff Pike. "Sheriff," she said, her tone level and respectful. "You have voiced concerns about the character of Jonah Cole. You have repeated a story about a widow, Rosa Delgado, who was supposedly wronged by him. I have here a letter from that very same woman." A shocked murmur rippled through the congregation. Pike's face became a stony mask. He had not expected this. He had not expected her. Eliza's voice did not waver as she read Rosa's letter aloud. She read it slowly, letting each word sink into the silent church. She read of brotherhood, of protection, of a fair price and a new life. When she spoke of Rosa's new husband, her dress shop, and the baby to come, she could feel the atmosphere in the room begin to shift. The abstract, victimized widow of Pike's rumors was being replaced by a real woman, a woman who was happy, prosperous, and grateful. When she finished the letter, she held up the official document, and this, she announced, is an affidavit, a legal and binding statement of these facts, bearing the official seal of the city of Santa Fe. She did not need to say anything more. The truth, clear and undeniable, had been spoken. The whispers that filled the church were different now, laced with indignation, not at Jonah, but at the man who had so clearly lied to them. The townsfolk looked at Sheriff Pike, and for the first time, they saw not a protector, but a manipulator. Pike stood frozen for a long moment, the color draining from his face. He was trapped, exposed in the one place where honor was supposed to be absolute. Without a word, he turned and stalked out of the church, the heavy oak doors closing behind him with a funereal thud. The tide of public opinion had turned. That night, a cold, clear moon washed the streets of Dry Willow in silver. Pike did not go to the saloon to drown his humiliation. He went to work. He knew the letter had bought Jonah and Eliza time and goodwill, but the real proof of his and Holloway's crimes lay elsewhere. A detailed ledger, kept not in the bank, but in the back office of a feed and grain warehouse Holloway owned at the edge of town. It recorded every secret transaction, every parcel of land on the north bank, every payment made to Sable Jack's enforcers. It had to be destroyed. He did not know he was being watched. Jonah, anticipating that a cornered snake would strike, had not been idle. He and Mateo sat in the deep shadows of the building across the street, two silent silhouettes in the darkness. They saw the flicker of a lantern in the warehouse's back window. "He is there," Mateo whispered. "We wait," Jonah said, his voice a low growl. "We do not want him. We want what he leaves behind." They waited for what felt like an eternity. The lantern light inside moved erratically. Finally, the light was extinguished. A few minutes later, Pike slipped out the back door of the warehouse, a furtive shadow that quickly disappeared into the night. Jonah and Mateo moved swiftly, crossing the street and forcing the lock on the warehouse door. Inside, the air was thick with the bitter smell of burning paper. A potbelly stove in the corner of the office glowed a dull red, its small metal door slightly ajar. Using a length of metal strapping, Jonah pried the hot door open. Inside, a thick, blackened book smoldered. "He was in a hurry," Mateo said, pulling on a pair of thick leather work gloves. He reached into the stove and carefully, painstakingly, pulled out the burning ledger. Most of it fell away into ash and glowing embers, but the back half, where the heat had not fully penetrated, remained intact. Mateo dropped it onto the dirt floor and stamped out the glowing edges. Jonah knelt, gently turning the charred pages with the tip of his knife. Much of it was illegible, a black, brittle ruin. But then he found it, a series of entries, the ink browned but still readable, names of ranchers on the north bank, dates of sale, and next to them, a second set of entries, payments, cash withdrawals from a special account at Holloway's bank, listed as security consultations, and next to each payment, a name, Sable Jack. He had it, not all of it, but enough. It was a piece of a puzzle, a fragile, fire-damaged fragment of the truth. As he stood there in the dark warehouse, the burnt ledger in his hands, Eliza was at home, staring out her own window. She was no longer afraid. The woman who had read that letter in the church was not the same one who had counted cartridges in the quiet of her store. She had learned a hard lesson in the past few days. Justice was not a gift bestowed by men with badges. It was a structure, fragile and complex, that had to be built by hand, piece by piece, by ordinary people who were willing to risk everything to tell the truth, even if their voices shook as they spoke it. The day of the seasonal market dawned under a bruised, swollen sky. A heavy, humid stillness pressed down on Dry Willow. A stillness that promised violence, but for now, the town was a riot of noise and color. Ranchers and their families, folks from outlying homesteads, and even a few well-dressed men from the railroad survey team filled the main street. It was a day for trade, for gossip, for a celebration of a future that felt, for the first time, tangible. Elias Holloway was the unofficial king of the festival. He sat at a large oak table set up in front of his bank, a stack of freshly printed land deeds at his elbow and a bottle of expensive whiskey at the other. He smiled his soft, placid smile, signing documents with a flourish, shaking hands, and accepting the congratulations of men who believed they were selling him worthless scrubland for a handsome profit. He was a spider in the center of a newly spun web, and the whole town was buzzing with the promise of his silk. Across the street, in the shadow of the mercantile, was a far more modest display. Eliza had set up a simple plank table, much like the ones used by farmers to sell their produce. A hand-painted sign, propped against a crate, read, "The Dry Willow Town Library Fund." There were no books on the table. Instead, arranged with the precision of a museum exhibit, was her evidence. In the center lay the charred, brittle remains of the back half of Holloway's ledger. To one side, protected under a piece of clean glass, was a perfect plaster cast Mateo had made of the horseshoe print from the grotto, the distinctive HS of Holloway's livery clearly visible. On the other side was Rosa's letter, its fine script a testament to a truth that could not be burned or buried. People were drawn to it, first by curiosity, then by a dawning, horrified understanding. They gathered in small, murmuring groups, pointing at the scorched pages, at the damning horseshoe, at the letter that had already been read aloud in the house of God. It was a silent, powerful accusation, and its silence was more damning than any shout. Jonah stood near the table, not as a guard, but as a quiet anchor. He leaned against a support post of the mercantile's porch, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the proceedings at the bank. His very presence was an act of defiance. Sheriff Pike saw the crowd gathering. He saw what was on the table. He strode across the street, his face a thundercloud, his good hand resting on the butt of his pistol. The humiliation of the church, the loss of control, the town's wavering loyalty, it all boiled up in him as a black, bitter rage. He did not go to Eliza. He went straight for Jonah. "Cole," Pike's voice was a low snarl, "I have had enough of your games. You are under arrest for disturbing the peace and interfering with the lawful commerce of this town." Jonah did not move from his position against the post. "What peace is that?" "Sheriff," he asked, his voice calm. "The peace of a thief, in the night." Pike's face contorted. He had lost the argument of words. He would win with force, resisting arrest. "Is it?" He lunged forward, his hand grabbing for Jonah's arm. And in that exact moment, the sky broke. It was not a storm. It was a judgment, a sound, a low, guttural roar that came not from the clouds but from the canyons upstream, drowned out every other noise. The wind hit them like a fist, and then the rain came down, not in drops, but in a solid, gray wall of water. Panic erupted. People screamed and ran for cover. Horses reared, their eyes white with terror. The roar from the canyon grew louder, a monstrous, grinding sound. Then they saw it. A churning, muddy wave, 10 feet high, filled with splintered trees and debris, crested the rise and bore down on the town, following the path of Willow Creek. It hit the small wooden bridge with the sound of a giant bone snapping. The bridge vanished, its timbers tossed like matchsticks in the torrent. A woman shrieked, a sound of pure animal terror that cut through even the storm's roar. "My boy Billy." Eliza saw him. It was little Billy Gable, the preacher's son, one of her brightest students. He had been standing near the creek bank and had slipped in the sudden, slick mud. The current caught him immediately, pulling him into the raging, brown water. Without a second's hesitation, Jonah moved. He launched himself into the flood, his powerful body cutting through the current in a way that seemed impossible. At the same instant, another figure dove in from the opposite bank. It was Barrett Pike, some long-buried instinct, some remnant of the lawman he was supposed to be, had driven him to act. For a terrifying moment, the two men, rivals for the town's soul, for Eliza's heart, were united in a single, desperate purpose. The water was a chaotic hell of logs and churning debris. Jonah, stronger and more at home in the raw violence of nature, reached the boy first. He grabbed a fistful of Billy's small shirt, pulling the sputtering, terrified child's head above the water. At that moment, a massive beam from the broken bridge, a jagged spear of splintered wood, cartwheeled through the water. It slammed into Pike, sending him spinning. He cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, and lost his footing. The current, savage and unforgiving, grabbed him, pulling him under. Jonah saw it happen. He had the boy. He was struggling toward the bank, where men were forming a human chain. He could have let Pike go. No one would have blamed him. It would have been the storm's justice. He could have let the water wash away his enemy. But he did not. In a movement of pure, unthinking grace, he shoved the child with all his might toward the waiting hands of the townsmen. "Take him," he roared. Then, as Billy was pulled to safety, Jonah turned and threw himself back into the heart of the current, after Pike. He caught up to him just as Pike's head went under for a second time. Jonah grabbed a handful of the sheriff's collar and hauled him back to the surface. Pike was choking, his face pale with shock and a dawning terror. For a moment, they were just two men, helpless in the grip of a force far greater than their own hatred. Then Jonah began the brutal, punishing fight back to the muddy, debris-strewn bank. The entire town, huddled under the awnings of the storefronts, watched it happen. They saw Jonah Cole save the preacher's son, and then they saw him save the sheriff. They saw him offer his hand to the man who had tried to destroy him and pull him from a certain death. The rain continued to pour, a relentless, punishing torrent. The crowd, dazed and shivering, sought the sturdiest shelter they could find, the large, dry feed and grain warehouse that belonged to Elias Holloway. They crowded inside, the air thick with the smell of damp wool, fear, and wet earth. Lanterns were lit, casting long, dancing shadows on the stacked sacks of grain. Pike sat on a pile of burlap bags, shivering uncontrollably. He was stripped of his gun belt, his badge, his authority. He was just a wet, defeated man, saved by his enemy. He stared at his trembling hands, and for the first time in his life, he felt the hot, unfamiliar sting of shame. Jonah was on the other side of the warehouse, his ribs aching, being fussed over by a grateful Mrs. Gable. Eliza found Pike in a quiet corner, away from the main crowd. She stood before him, her dress dripping, her face resolute in the flickering lantern light. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Sheriff," she said, her voice low and clear, "I have one question for you. Did you want me, or did you want the power?" Pike looked up at her. He saw no triumph in her eyes, no gloating, only a deep, sorrowful searching. The lie, the bluster, the arrogance that had been his armor for so long had been washed away by the flood. He looked at this woman he had coveted, this woman whose strength he had so profoundly underestimated. And the truth came out, a ragged, painful whisper. "Both," he said, and then he finally broke, bowing his head, his shoulders shaking. "I wanted both." He reached up to his wet vest and, with fumbling fingers, unpinned the silver star of his office. He held it in his palm for a long moment, the symbol of all his ambition, all his corruption. He looked at it, then placed it on a damp wooden crate beside him, the silver star on the wet, dark wood, the power, fallen. "It was Holloway," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. It was always Holloway. He knew the railroad's final survey route before anyone. They were never going to follow the creek bed. They are cutting straight across the North Bank Mesa. He needed all of it, all the land, and the water rights from Cole's Spring, Sable Jack, the fire. All of it was Holloway. To scare people, to make them sell cheap before the real route was announced. As he spoke, one of the railroad surveyors, a man who had been sheltering nearby, stepped out of the shadows. He had heard every word. He looked at the broken sheriff, at the earnest, unyielding woman, and then at the huddled, frightened townspeople. He walked to the center of the warehouse, his face grim. "Attention, everyone," he called out, his voice ringing with authority. "As the official representative of the Santa Fe Pacific Railroad, I'm hereby announcing that all pending land transactions in the Dry Willow District are frozen. A full federal inquiry will be conducted." A stunned silence fell over the warehouse, followed by a rising murmur. Elias Holloway, who had been trying to make himself small near the back, went pale. His kingdom, built on lies and intimidation, had been washed away in a single, violent afternoon. The town, now united in its anger and its relief, turned as one to look at him. There was nowhere for him to run. The floodwaters receded as quickly as they had come, leaving behind a world remade. The main street of Dry Willow was a swamp of red mud and splintered wood. But as the sun emerged, the townspeople began the slow, arduous work of putting their lives back together. It was a shared labor that healed more than just the physical damage. It mended the fractured soul of the community. In the quiet that followed the storm, truths that had been hidden in shadows were brought into the clean, sharp light. One evening, as Eliza and her father sat on the mercantile porch, watching the last of the sunset paint the mesas in hues of purple and rose, Silas finally spoke of a secret he had kept for many years. "I knew he would come back," he said, his voice a low rumble in the twilight. He was not looking at Eliza, but out at the horizon, as if watching a long-anticipated rider approach. "I knew because I told him to." Eliza turned to him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about, Father?" "That boy, Jonah," Silas continued, his clouded eyes seeming to see into the past. "He wrote to me, a few years after he left, a clumsy, heartfelt letter from a cattle camp in Texas. He asked about you, asked if you were happy, if you were waiting." He sighed, a long, rattling sound. "I wrote him back. I told him you were a woman of substance, and you deserved a man of substance, not a boy with wandering feet and a heart full of wild oats. I told him to go out and become a man, to learn a trade, to build something, to be someone he could be proud of. And I told him, when you have become that man, a good and decent man, then you can come back for my daughter. If you cannot, then do us all the kindness of staying away." He paused, reaching out to pat her hand. "We exchanged letters, off and on, for more than 10 years. He told me about the ranches he worked, the money he was saving. He told me about his partner, and what happened near Santa Fe. Every letter, he would ask about you, and every letter, I would tell him the truth, that you were strong, that you were smart, that you were the heart of this town. I never told you because it was not my promise to keep. It was his. I just made sure he understood the terms." Eliza stared at her father, a wave of understanding so profound it was almost painful washing over her. Jonah's 18-year absence had not been an abandonment. It had been a pilgrimage, a long, hard road to becoming a man worthy of the promise he had made as a boy. He had not returned late. He had returned when he was finally ready. The town began to rebuild itself, not just with new lumber, but with new leadership. Elias Holloway was gone, taken by federal marshals to face trial. In his place, a new town council was formed. At their first meeting, by unanimous vote, they elected Ivy Monroe as the new town clerk. Her clear-eyed honesty and Eastern education seen as an asset for a town determined to have a respectable future. Eliza, in turn, was given full authority and a proper budget to establish the community library, her small bookshelf now destined to become the cornerstone of the town's intellectual life. Out on the range, Mateo Vargas, armed with the original survey maps from the courthouse, supervised a team of men as they methodically moved the boundary stakes back to their rightful places, restoring not just land, but faith in the rule of law. A week after the flood, Barrett Pike left Dry Willow. He did not slip away in the night. He left in the full light of day, his horse packed, his face clean-shaven. He stopped in front of the mercantile, where Eliza was sweeping the porch. He dismounted and stood before her, his hat in his hands. He looked thinner, older, but the arrogance was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, weary resignation. "I am taking a position with the Territorial Rangers," he said, "far south of here. It is a start." "I wish you well, Sheriff," Eliza said, and she found that she meant it. He nodded, unable to meet her gaze for more than a second. "He is a good man. Eliza, better than me." He finally looked at her, and his expression was one of simple, unadorned sincerity. "Be happy." He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back, a solitary figure disappearing into the vast, indifferent desert. He left behind no love, but in his final, humbled act, he had found a sliver of honor. That evening, Eliza and Jonah walked down to the creek, to the old cottonwood tree. The flood had scoured its roots, but the old tree stood firm. "What will you do now?" Jonah asked, his voice gentle. "Your work is here. The library, the children. This town needs you." "And you," she countered, looking at him. "Your ranch is in New Mexico. Your future is there." The unspoken question hung between them, as vast as the twilight sky. For a moment, her old fear, the conflict between duty and love, returned. But it was a pale ghost now, with no power over her. "I have been thinking," she said, her voice thoughtful, "about what this town really needs. It does not need me to sell flour and count cartridges forever. Young Tom Pritchard from Tucson has written twice now, asking to buy the Mercantile. He is a good boy, with a sharp mind for business. He would serve the town well." Jonah listened, his expression intent, letting her find her own way. "I could sell it to him," she continued, the idea taking firm root, blossoming in her mind. "And I could use a portion of the profits to create a permanent fund for the school. An endowment, Ivy calls it, to buy books and slates and supplies for generations to come. That would be a better legacy than a well-stocked shelf of pickles. Do not you think?" She turned to him, her eyes shining with a clear, bright purpose. "I do not want to leave Dry Willow behind. I want to plant something here that will continue to grow long after I am gone. And then I want to go with you and plant something new." She hesitated, a small worry clouding her face. "But my father—" "I have already spoken with Silas," Jonah said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "He says the dry air on the mesa will be better for his eyes, and he has some ideas about building a proper porch swing." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes. Tears of joy and relief so pure they felt like a benediction. He had not just asked for her heart, he had made a place for her entire world. The wedding was in the fall, when the aspen trees on Jonah's New Mexico ranch turned the hillsides to rivers of gold. It was not in a church, but on the wide, newly built porch of his small, sturdy ranch house. The guests were few, Silas, his eyes clearer than they had been in years, Mateo, who stood as Jonah's witness, and Ivy, who had made the long journey from Dry Willow to stand with her friend. Eliza wore a simple dress of deep blue, and in her hair was a sprig of sage. They spoke their vows as the setting sun bathed the world in a gentle, forgiving light, promising not a future free of hardship, but a future faced together. That night, there was no awkwardness, no fear. There was only a profound and quiet homecoming, wrapped in the silence of the high desert, under a blanket of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. They learned a new language. It was a language spoken not with words, but with the simple, honest touch of a hand. A conversation of held breaths and shared warmth in the cool night air. It was a gentle exploration, a tender confirmation of a love that had waited a lifetime to be born. It was the quiet promise of a shared dawn. In the spring, after the last of the snow had melted from the high peaks, Jonah took Eliza to a small, protected meadow on their land. He had tilled a long, straight line in the rich earth. Waiting for them were a dozen young cottonwood saplings, their roots bundled in burlap. They worked together, side by side, digging the holes, settling the young trees into the earth, their hands moving in a comfortable, easy rhythm. When they were finished, they stood back, looking at the hopeful, slender line of new life. Jonah put his arm around her, pulling her close. "The old promise," he said, his voice a low, contented murmur against her hair, replanted with new roots. She leaned her head against his shoulder, looking out at the vast, open land that was their future. On the distant horizon, a thin plume of smoke signaled the steady, relentless approach of the railroad. It would bring change. It would bring the world to their doorstep. But it no longer felt like a threat. They had built their foundation not on the shifting sands of greed and ambition, but on the solid rock of honor, courage, and a love that had weathered every storm. The future was coming, and they were ready for it. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to support us and help this story be heard by more people.